because he's saying, I've been converted, and let me tell you about this guy named Jesus. And the Jews didn't want to hear that. And now in verse 23. Now after many days were passed, the Jews plotted to kill him. But their plot became known to Saul, and they watched the gates day and night to kill him. Then the disciples took him by night and let him down through the wall in a large basket. And then the first part of verse 26. And when Saul had come to Jerusalem, that's where he's going to go next. But the school of suffering. Jesus never promised us an easy journey. He never promised us that the cross would not get heavy, or that the hill would not be hard to climb. He never promised us that living the Christian life was just going to be easy. But listen, He has promised a safe landing. You're going to suffer. We're all going to suffer. We have to go through this school of suffering. When Paul returned to Damascus there from that Arabian desert, he was a marked man. He had a target upon his back. Because it says there in those verses, they plotted to kill him. And so could you imagine how Saul must have felt there? As it says there in verse 24, they watched the gates day and night. And then the disciples, they took him, they let him down through the wall in a large basket, almost like he was some sort of criminal. So it must have been humiliating. But this was just a foreshadow of the suffering that Saul, who would become Paul, that he was going to see. Most of you know, I'm going to assume, most of you know the sufferings that Paul would go through when he became the apostle. The stripes, the beatings that he took. He was stoned. He was left for dead. He suffered 2 or 3 shipwrecks. All of the persecution, the many times that he was in prison, the cold, the hunger, the thirst. And then he even says there, the thorn in his flesh. That we're not even really sure what exactly that was. But there was some kind of thorn in his flesh that hindered him. That is suffering. Let me ask you something. When's the last time you were persecuted because of your faith? Well, you probably can't think of it, can you? You see, folks, we live in a free country. We live in a country where we are free to come into this nice building and to worship our God without the fear of persecution. And we don't want to go out and share our faith because we're afraid that we're going to suffer, that something is going to happen. You see, they say the measure of your character is what it takes to get you to quit. So Paul must have had a lot of character. I mean, think about it for just a minute. If you went into work tomorrow and things just don't go your way, boss starts yelling at you first thing, nothing seems to work right, and all the co-workers are just down on you, just outright rude. You're thinking, man, I'm suffering. I've had it with this place. Are you just going to up and quit your job? You say, well, that's ridiculous. I have to stay there and work. I have to go to work tomorrow. Okay? I say that every day. Every morning I get up. I have to get up and go to this place again tomorrow. Okay? No, we can't just up and quit. You say that's foolish because I have to work. I have to make a living. I have to make the money. I will endure all that suffering because I have to make a living and pay the bills. But now listen. So many times we come to church and we quit on God. We quit. We'll quit coming to church. Or we'll just hear something. I mean, think about it. If Paul was a church member today, his suffering list might be something like this. Well, no one shook my hand today. Nobody gave me a call this week. Well, I didn't care for the way they looked at me. Nobody noticed my new dress that I had on. Well, they didn't give me the position that I wanted in the church. Well, that preacher, boy, he stepped on my toes this morning. I didn't like what he was preaching about. Well, we didn't sing any of the songs that I like to sing. And so what do? We quit. We quit working for God. We just quit on God because we say, Lord, poor me, I'm suffering so much. That's not what Paul saw. Paul saw the suffering. He experienced the suffering. It was a back to school for Saul, and this, we could say, was the school of hard knocks. Now listen to me. You have to go through suffering in life. That is one of the schools you have to go through. And I could spend this morning trying to explain why Christians have to suffer, but that is part of the life. And let me just briefly say, and just kind of in a nutshell, maybe you're here and you're thinking, well, why? Here I am trying to live the Christian life, but why am I suffering so much? In a nutshell, let me just say this. God has to test your faith somehow. And the only way He can test your faith is through suffering. Through trials and through tests and even through temptation, He will test your faith. You see, God, He looked down and He saw a diamond in the rough. And so it's kind of like He's chiseling away. He's knocking off the rough edges with His hammer, with His chisel, with those things that aren't quite perfect yet, but are very much necessary in life. He puts it through the fire to refine us, so the impurities can rise to the top, and there comes forth a more valuable product. You see, it's when you go through the fire, and when you come out, you know that God was with you all along. He'll never leave you. He'll never forsake you. He was there the whole time through the suffering. Listen to me this morning. It's in the valley that we learn some of our best lessons in life. You see, it's easy to praise God when you're on the mountaintop. Boy, when things are going good and you're up on the mountain, and it's easy to praise God then. But when you get down in the valley, when you're suffering, when things are not going good, that's where we learn some of the best lessons from God. And you say, well, what's your point? My point is this. Here's what you need to pray to God. Lord, help me learn what I'm supposed to learn through this lesson, or through this suffering, so that I don't have to repeat it. And folks, that's some of our problems. We just bring the suffering back on ourselves. Because God has been trying to teach us a lesson for the past 10 years, but we just keep going back down into the valley. We're not learning the lesson that God is trying to teach us, and the suffering just keeps on coming. And so this morning, listen to me, the lesson you need to learn from God is that you just need to pray, help me learn what I'm supposed to from this suffering so I do not have to repeat it. Well, Saul had to go through the school of solitude. Then he had to go through the school of suffering. And then the last school was the school of seasoning. I want you to turn back over to Galatians chapter 1. And in Galatians chapter 1 there, where we first started, and if you'll look at verse 18, First he went to the desert of Arabia. And then he went to Damascus. And now for this school of seasoning, he is going to go to Jerusalem. In particular, in verse 18, he says, Then after those 3 years in the desert, I went up to Jerusalem to see who? To see Peter. Now, if you know anything about the Bible and the disciples, Peter was pretty much the head disciple. Now, I mean, don't get me wrong, he's not classified that, okay? It's not like, but he was pretty much the one. Peter was always the one sticking his foot in his mouth, alright? Saying things and then learning the lesson, okay? But here's what Saul is saying. Saul has said, I've been converted, I've went to God, I've spent time alone with God, I've went through all of this suffering, Now I want to go see Peter.